Moments of inspiration mixed with time to network, IBJ Media Events has you covered. From industry deep dives to awards celebrating Indiana's top leaders, see what's coming up and reserve your seat at ibj.com/RSVP.
Rescuing threatened landmarks starts with public awareness. To aim the spotlight on places in jeopardy, each year Indiana Landmarks announces a list of the state's 10 most endangered historic places. The designation helps rally support and attract partners who can help find solutions that lead to rescue and revitalization.
It's a delicate balancing act, preserving Hoosier history versus progress. This week on the Business and Beyond podcast, presented by PNC, we catch up with new Indiana Landmarks CEO Brad Ward, his roots in Jasper, why the organization is at a turning point, and how preserving Hoosier landmarks serves as a key driver for Indiana's economy. And I'm pleased to be joined on the podcast this week by Brad Ward. Brad is the new, relatively new, took over, actually slid into office in April of this year as president and CEO of a very important organization in our state, Indiana Landmarks. And Brad, thanks for taking the time.
Good morning, and thank you for having me come join you. As we were saying offline there, last time you and I were together, we were on the beautiful historic League Stadium field down in Huntingburg, Indiana, one of those other cherished landmarks that certainly excited to expand the horizons for all these landmarks we have here in Indiana.
Absolutely. I remember that well. We took the show down there and did the whole thing, and it was a good time. And are you aware of what they're doing down there? At least they were. I don't. That may have gone by the wayside, but they were trying to get a Major League Baseball game in Evansville.
I was with Lloyd Winnicky not too long ago, and certainly there are continued strong efforts to try to make that possible. And what I really admired about it from Landmark's perspective is, you obviously have Bosse Field, a treasured facility, and they're being very thoughtful about how they ensure that it is protected and part of the fabric of the community, even as they might move to a new venue for a larger scale program. So I wish them well in progressing forward. There's nothing like attracting a baseball team of high caliber and being so close to so many important league, filler or the feeder program. It really is a great opportunity for Evansville, and glad they're keeping Bosse in sights too as they do it.
Absolutely. Well, you are back in Indiana, coming most directly from Montana, but you're no stranger. You're an Indiana native of Jasper, southern Indiana, Dubois County. And so give us a little thumbnail, Brad, of your background. Again, you came from Montana-based philanthropy tech firm, out there, but have gotten extensive experience in Indiana as well. Give us a little bit on your background.
Yeah, well, I was very fortunate. I started with the Huntingburg Foundation, and then we ultimately merged with the Dubois County Community Foundation. That was the start of my career, as I like to think about it, in community philanthropy. And what a great run that was. And that's probably where I got introduced to this notion of preservation. I definitely did not call myself a preservationist. I just was caring about the things that mattered to the community. And we were saving some of those assets that could be reutilized in meaningful ways, whether it was downtown, on 4th Street in Huntingburg, whether it was the Astor Theater in Jasper, or some of the warehouses that could serve as a cultural center or new mixed use. But I spent a number of years, almost a decade, working in the community foundation space here in Indiana, and then started working nationally out of DC with the Council on Foundations. And it was there I was working with local place-based funders from across North America. And that's really where I started to get a really much better understanding of just how this work is taking place across the country. It was no secret that every time I was somewhere, I would see something that I thought could be replicated. I might be shooting an email to, the former mayor Terry Seitz or Denny Spinner, and say, you got to take a look at this. This is probably something we could do in our community. Your home just never leaves or escapes. But even when after the council in DC, you had mentioned I went to work with a Montana-based tech company and still serving philanthropy. And interestingly, at that time, I was actually in Charleston, South Carolina. So I was one of their many remote staff for working for that tech company. And Charleston is a mecca of historic preservation and a living city of preservation. So again, just like when we were saving buildings on 4th Street or in downtown Jasper, I didn't realize just how much preservation was clearly something that was of importance to me. And it really was through the whole interview process of Landmarks where I started to just see how much investing in places and the stories that stand the test of time really align with what I'm about and what I think I can contribute professionally.
Well, as you arrived in the spring, over the course of the past several months, I know you recently took a fact-finding trip around the state to really get a feel for things going on. I'm sure it was probably like drinking out of a fire hose for you to see and to learn about things going on. What'd you take away from that trip?
Well, I'll say this, every community has a pretty cool coffee shop in an old building somewhere, and I visited every single one of them. And, even as you and I sip on our coffee here, I realize how that probably fueled a portion of my trip across the state. But yeah, we've racked over 3,000 miles, and I had the really good fortune. I made the decision early on. I wanted to take the family with me. I've got an 8-year-old son and a 14-year-old daughter, and my wife and I really just felt it was important that we don't just get embedded in Indianapolis, but that we understand what's happening across the state, given the landscape that Landmark serves in a statewide capacity. And so we just visited so many amazing assets that we contribute to the landmark status of what makes Indiana unique. And we met what probably was most inspirational was the people that are behind it. And you see it all the time in your day-to-day interaction, the care and the commitment people have to their local communities. If you could bottle that up and sell it, we'd all be millionaires. There's something special about that when you get the chance to visit those communities.
Yeah. Were there any projects or communities or things that kind of caught your eye on the trip?
I think one of my favorite stories was there's a place called Valley House in Brookville, Indiana, very small community. We had the Valley House. This is just a row of structures along downtown that was actually a part of our 10 most endangered list when we started that list in 1991. And here in 2021, it went through a $11 million reinvestment to make it a mixed use and apartments. And the story I heard, which I thought was fabulous, they're like, we haven't had an apartment complex built in over 40 years in this community, and we're about to just create this massive infrastructure. But it wasn't just about the fact that they were creating affordable housing alongside market rate housing, and that they were revitalizing this row of buildings and fixing up the ironclad metal and taking the sheet metal or the stamped ceilings, it wasn't just about the architecture. It was that they were also aligning it with the opportunity zone funding that was taking place at that time in the 2020s arena. They were addressing housing and workforce housing and trying to, create that kind of stability. It was just the way that this property it had been around for 160 years. So it had clearly seen a number of generations, and many people had incredible stories to tell about the different hardware stores or restaurants or whatever might have taken place in the years over that time. But it was just how it was pulling it forward. Mm-hmm. It was taking something from the past that had meant something to so many generations, and it was propelling it into being not just a resource, but a solution to some of the challenges the community was facing.
And as you talk about that, I can't help but think about the role of Indiana Landmarks. It's about saving structures, saving historic structures for sure. But much bigger than that is the role it plays in economic development and community development and ways in which it can help transform a community. I think the biggest example, of course, would be, West Baden and French Lick and the Bill and Gail Cook and the family, the company just transformed, really, I think you could argue, saved that area in many respects. But talk about, in your view, on the role of Indiana Landmarks in a community development, economic development perspective.
We are nothing in terms of being an organization of value if we aren't attuned to what are the community needs that we're trying to address. What is the public benefit we're trying to create or offer in terms of solutions? And so preservation just becomes the tool, and it just becomes the means to the end in terms of what we're actually trying to solve. And so much of this is tied to that placemaking element. And you're right that you cannot underscore the tremendous impact that folks like Bill and Gail Cook and even Carl Cook,
Yeah.
their son, have had on this community. And West Baden is by far one of the most magnificent transformations we've ever seen. But on that flip side of that, some 500 some $1 million restoration, Landmarks has to its credit over 3,000 saves across the state. And so as I was talking to Judy O'Bannon just yesterday, actually, and she reminded me, it's those 3,000, it's the 40 or 50 saves that happen a year, every year, over and over again, that
Mhm.
really just kind of they ignite an opportunity in the smallest of communities as much as they do the biggest of communities. And there's just this play at how we're all kind of working towards the same end. How do we create a more stable economy? How do we create the livelihoods and the places for people to live and work and really solve for some of the problems and even just create opportunities, right? Like when you think of some of the coolest restaurants and places to have coffee or to convene a meeting, sometimes they are in these culturally rich, historic places, right? And they lend themselves to giving you just a different feeling about
Mhm.
what you're doing than if you're in just a standard, new construction build. And not to say that not all new construction isn't architecturally beautiful and contributing, but on the whole, I look a lot of times at new construction as I, went across the country, even beyond the state. I just had to question how much of this will we actually celebrate in 50 years? How much of
Mhm.
it will still be here? And that 1920s bungalow down the street, or that Craftsman, or that 100-year-old Italianate, they are the things that we're going to continue to gravitate towards, whether we realize it or not. And they are really strong, stable forces that keep neighborhoods alive and they keep us constantly moving forward. And some of the most challenged economies, and I won't name names, but some of the most challenged communities economically is where they just gutted places and they took out. And so now you have all this infill, and it just feels like it's too monumental to really actually tackle. So there's something to be said, and I'll go one more step further because I think Gary, you agree. You think of all the small businesses that get
Mhm.
started in Indiana, they are bootlegging and they are like they are just scrappy, right? They just have to really start with the very minimal. And so these old rusty buildings are exceptional places for them to have space to trial and error and do their innovation and allow them to take off. And if they
Mhm.
had to start by renting or leasing new construction or facilities, those ideas may never take off. And so these old buildings, sometimes they just need space to let new ideas flourish.
Yeah. Is it a balancing act for Indiana landmarks on a project? Say, for example, you want to save certain aspects of a structure or whatever the case might be, and a developer might say that's a pain in the butt, and
Mhm.
that's causing us headaches. And they look at historic preservation in a more in a negative way. But so is it kind of a balancing act? You want to save the historic piece. You don't want to, kind of foul up the overall development.
I think you always have to have an element of compromise and you also have to an element of understanding the bottom line, right? And ultimately, you want a developer who is open to understanding that there are multiple bottom lines. There's the financial bottom line, and then there's also the community or social bottom line. And a lot of times, developers, by nature of being just lovers of the built environment, they actually are drawn to these old buildings. They're drawn to the architecture. They're drawn to the hefty construction and craftsmanship that they garnered. And so in many cases, and they also know that they know the sustainability. They know that it is the most expensive thing that we do is to have to tear it down and get it off into the landfill and then start at a net zero where you're already millions in just trying to get rid of it. So I do think that they come to the table in more cases than not with a real genuine interest. The issue is have we incentivized as a state the ability for them to find that win-win on the bottom line, because they will sacrifice some, but they can't sacrifice all. And that's why this is actually, interestingly, very much a private and a public endeavor. And so we as a public sector, as the government agencies and state budgets, and that's why these tax credits, why they're so advantageous, because they draw in billions, right? While they also maintain some of that character, that charm, and that integrity. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't just take compromise. It also takes all of us coming to the table to solve for what is really important to us and what do we want our communities to look like and feel like in not just 5, 10 years, but 50, 60, 100 years.
Shaking over for a guy who held your job for several decades, Marsh Davis. In fact, I think you're only the fourth president in the history of the organization, which is something like 60, 65 years in existence. As you think about your predecessors and what they brought to the table, at your leadership, talk about you bringing new ideas to the table, but also perhaps kind of respecting what has been built over the last number of years.
Yeah, I try not to think about it too much, Gary, because it's daunting when you realize just how instrumental they have been and how long tenured they were. That kind of stability, though, breeds what we've inherited. And that's why I do feel incredibly grateful for what they've done. And, the core mission really hasn't changed over the last 60 years. I think what I take into consideration as I kind of explore what comes next, I just acknowledge that regardless of what they have given us, times and the attitudes, they've evolved, and the practices they've modernized, and tactics, they've just diversified, right? And so we as an organization, we got to be able to adapt to those types of scenarios. You also have to acknowledge that, this organization went from 10 people with Marsh Davis to 45 people. And so now we have an organizational infrastructure that we got to make sure is well oiled and well, aligned, so that we can support this pretty incredible network that we've got now with 9 different regional offices, so that we have people that are highly accessible, they're highly well trained, and they're community assets just as much as they are Indiana Landmarks employees, right? So the team has really given a lot of that stability that we're going to need to go forward. But the landscape is shifting. It's just you don't have to, better than anyone. You don't. The news moves at a cycle of every few minutes. Something new that is pretty dramatic comes out, and so when the playbook isn't really written for how to, play this game that we're in right now, it means that we've got to be highly adaptive, and we can't be too comfortable in what we believed or thought was the mechanisms that we might deploy to save buildings or bring heritage to the forefront.
Much more ahead with Brad Ward, the president and CEO at Indiana Landmarks. When we return, we'll talk about that evolution at Indiana Landmarks. Also get into a little bit of Brad's background and growing up in Indiana. That and much more when the Business End podcast returns.
As a bank, PNC prides itself on being boring. But the truth is they couldn't be more excited to serve the dynamic Indianapolis community. For nearly 160 years, they've quietly toiled away to deliver brilliant results for their equally brilliant clients. They have dedicated PNC teams throughout the local area all ready to do the boring work to help you unlock your own brilliance. PNC Bank, brilliantly boring since 1865. PNC Bank, National Association member FDIC.
We build Indiana. The Laborers International Union of North America are men and women building roads and bridges to get Hoosiers where they're going today and a new energy infrastructure that will keep Indiana competitive tomorrow. LIUNA's over 12,000 statewide members also grow local economies, earning good union wages, shopping where they live and work, and paying taxes. We build Indiana for good jobs and stronger communities. The Laborers International Union of North America. We are LIUNA.
And welcome back to the Business and Beyond podcast presented by PNC. My guest this week is Brad Ward, who is the relatively new president and CEO at Indiana Landmarks. He slid into that role in the spring of this year, taking over for Marsh Davis, who for many years led the organization and did great work as well in that role. Brad, we talked a little bit about it in the first part of the podcast, but kind of the evolution of historic preservation as you look at it and Indiana Landmark's role. It's about saving buildings, saving history, but is there also a piece increasingly around advocacy and lobbying and those elements? Is that part of the job description now?
Yeah, and ever important, as we see both federal and state funding shifts and we see cuts and programmatic losses, it's just going to change the landscape in which how we serve our communities. And there's undoubtedly there is no way that the private sector or the philanthropic sector can actually fill that void. And so we rely heavily on that public benefit that generates and the public good that it just has a bottom line that is different than if you're trying to run a business or run a philanthropic organization. So we undoubtedly, I think over the years where we've seen our advocacy play a critical role is to avoid bad legislation that might harm or cause unintended consequences to the assets that drive communities and allow us to have this historical stock of buildings and homes and so forth. And I think we want to continue to help, shape good legislation that supports that. We've not been very good in the state of Indiana incentivizing through tax credits the adaptation of all of these warehouses and big buildings like our friends, around us have competitively. They're doing quite impressive, tax incentives to just kind of mobilize resources to create new investment. We have been able to benefit from federal tax credits. And I mentioned to you, we were up in Fort Wayne for our Preserving Historic Places conference where 300 to 400 practitioners from across the state came together. And, we were in the electric works, which was the old GE plant, just 5 minutes from downtown, massive infrastructure providing shelter to new businesses.
Sorry to jump in there, Brad, but talk about electric works, because I think and Fort Wayne has so much going on in their downtown, in particular along the rivers as well. But Electric Works is quite a project, and they built it through the pandemic. I mean, it's quite an accomplishment. What's your take as you look at Electric Works, that old former GE manufacturing campus?
Well, I think it starts with the fact that it took 10 years, right? You have to be open to the reality that none of this comes together quickly. You're talking about a complex capital stack. You're talking about a complexity of working with public and civic leaders, as well as the residentials that are impacted by anything that transpires. You obviously are still feeling the negative effects of a closure of that scale. Yeah. I think when the last person walked off the job in 2015 or 2016, it was a much smaller workforce, but at one point, that was 1/3 of the city's population that was working there. So it clearly had a pretty dramatic impact on the community. And so in some ways, the Electric Works that it is today, this magnificent 280, I think, to almost $300 million adaptive reuse project really kind of just demonstrates the fortitude of local leadership to say, we've got this asset. It will cost us millions to even consider trying to bring it down and then fill our landfills. And then what? What are we going to attract to fill that space? They were better off doing exactly what they did, figuring out what pieces of that project could be, handled by different entities. And one of the lead developers, Kevin Briggs, he initially in 2015 only envisioned one tiny piece of it. And it just kept snowballing and more players came to the table and more coordination was happening. And then now, as I said, 280, 300. And the best part is they still aren't even done. There's a whole east side campus on the other side that is waiting to sort of be activated. So I think the lessons that we've got to take from this is this takes time. There is no quick solution. And if anyone tells you there's probably going to be a few holes in that endeavor. And I think landmarks speaks to it. We hold assets. Sometimes we're fortunate to be able to turn them in a matter of a year or two, and sometimes it does. It takes an entire decade for the opportunity to present itself to be best use.
Yeah. Let's learn a little bit about you, Brad. As mentioned earlier, you grew up in Dubois County, southern Indiana. What was growing up like for you?
I just was fortunate to be in a community that is thriving and has a strong commitment to its well-being and to the well-being of each other, and openness to change, but also to kind of appreciate where we came from. The heritage is still very much alive and well, even for people who don't have that German heritage.
Uh-huh.
They treat it as a part of the story, and it does. And as I was even talking to First Lady Maureen Braun the other day, it just there's something inspiring about what is happening, downtown, across Main Street, and across the community, and how people take care of their community. And I grew up, going to school in old buildings and church in old buildings and downtown and restaurants, and I didn't again realize how much it contributed to my sense of place, right? And I can still recall the hardware store right downtown, or Siebert's, menswear, the role that those types of institutions played in my life. And it wasn't until I was in communities where the only option you had was a big box store, right?
Yeah.
That you started to realize how critical this was when a local person was running a local business and then had, local solutions. I still joke that my wife always, I never got a duplicate, tie or press shirt, because Siebert's always knew which ones I had, and my wife could go in and get me a gift for present, and there was never any duplication I had to worry about, because Siebert's had it down. They knew what I had and what I didn't. So,
That's great. Yeah.
yeah. So there was. I view that time fondly, and every time I get back there, I'll be getting back there next week to sit down with the Main Street program. Each time I get back, I'm reminded of just how special of a place that is to grow up in, and how that uniqueness is not specific to Jasper. It's happening all across the state of Indiana as I get to meet with local people and see why they care so much about their place.
You went to DePaul University in Greencastle. What was your thought process while you were in college? What did you want to do? Because it sounds like you kind of got into historic preservation a little bit later.
Yeah. I just always, education was a driving force. Public service was a driving force. I was very interested in public policy. I spent some time abroad and really got interested in sustainability, and how, I was in Ireland and the way the community approaches it there. And I also saw how faith interacts with community in Ireland. And so I just kept getting all these experiences. It probably made it more difficult to actually settle on a pathway. But what I knew was that community was consistently at the center of what mattered. And I was always interested in trying to be part of what are the catalytic forces that improve and make us better and stronger and more viable. And so DePaul really gave me that grounding. I used to be upset about, I didn't come out with a law degree, or medical, and finally somebody got tired of listening to me, who was one of my mentors from DePaul. He said, they gave you the greatest skill set. They gave you the ability to problem solve and create solutions where other people might not yet see them. And sometimes that is the greatest attribute that I feel I gained from my years at DePaul.
Yeah, well said. As we wrap up, Brad, looking forward, as you look at opportunities, also challenges that are going to be out there, what do you envision as you look, say, 5, 10 years down the road, in terms of the path for Indiana landmarks, and where would you like the organization to be, say, in the next decade?
Well, we will continue to be all about preserving places and preserving our heritage and the unique cultural aspects of Indiana. We're going to continue to do it, though, through the lens of how we are doing placemaking and how we're strengthening the bonds to place. And we have to be addressing community needs and really being thoughtful about what the public benefit is of these restoration projects or of these saves. But the other thing that I think is going to be absolutely critical to Indiana is you see such a loss in trades. You see a retirement, you see just a significant void occurring. Ask anyone who has even a reasonably modest old home or a desire to make any improvements. It's very difficult to get people with those skills. And so one of the areas that's going to be critical to us is promoting those do-it-yourself skills, really helping people feel comfortable in terms of a new generation of individuals having the curiosity to tackle their own maintenance. We've gotten so comfortable in society of being in this materialistic of we can just replace, and we're going to have to get to a more stable and sustainable repair. And so then on the flip side, I want to see heritage trades be a much stronger attribute to Indiana. The craftsmanship that we have been gifted and that we've inherited, when you look at the skills and the quality of what we were offering, we want to make sure that that continues in the next 100 years. The last thing I'll say that I think is important is you look at things like our Black Heritage Program, you look at our Sacred Places, Indiana. One of the things they're doing that I think is most instrumental is they don't just provide grants to do this work, they give that technical expertise and assistance. And so we're going to have to continue to expand our capacity to provide those valuable resources to communities across the state.
Brad Ward, the president and CEO at Indiana Landmarks. Brad, great to get a chance to catch up with you. I appreciate the time and very happy that you're back in Indiana. You're an Indiana native. And judging from our conversation the past 30 minutes or so, you've got a real passion for making a difference. So look forward to following your story.
Thank you so much.
All right. And thank you for joining us on this episode of the Business and Beyond podcast presented by PNC. We're a weekly conversation with achievers in business, sports, entertainment, and beyond. And you can download all of our episodes and get Indiana business news 24/7. All you have to do is go to InsideIndianaBusiness.com. I'm Gary Dick. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
The economy and the market are in a hairy place these days. It's up a lot, it's down a lot, it's sideways, and it seems on the hour there's breaking news coming out of all areas of the country. How do you get your head around that? How do you not go crazy in the process? I'm Peter Dunn. You may know me as Pete the Planner, IBJ columnist, and my job for years has been to help you understand your financial life better in context with everything else going on. So what am I encouraging you to do? Well, listen to the Pete the Planner Show. Yeah, it's a podcast. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts or simply listen at ibjpodcasts.com.
Your commute just got smarter. Turn drive time into growth time. The IBJ Media Podcast Network gives you front row access to leaders shaping Indiana's economy, culture, and future. No filler, just smart, relevant, local storytelling you won't get anywhere else. Find all of our shows by searching IBJ Media in your podcast app or visit ibjpodcasts.com.